Is vaping dangerous? Indeed, is vaping worse than smoking?
I hesitate to use the word safer because safe, I think, is a wrong way of looking at it. We're talking about arms reduction here. It's all comparative. Vaping is not safe. E-cigarettes are far more efficient in delivering this because it basically heats up a liquid that contains nicotine and you're inhaling the vapor. In terms of a delivery device, an e-cigarette is far more efficient than a tobacco cigarette in terms of delivering the stuff. If you're talking about vaping, once again, in terms of relative comparison, it may contain, depends who you believe, anything between 6 and 20 different chemicals. Huge issues around vaping that people are getting more and more concerned, people like myself as well. One is the uptake of vaping in young people and people who have never smoked before should have very tightly regulated small numbers of flavoring that can be analyzed, controlled, regulated by the regulatory authorities so that we know precisely what's going into it and whether or not there's a degree of harm. The problem now is that there are about 40,000 different flavors of vape. Vaping is relatively new. It's in the last 15, 20 years that it's been taken off in a big way. So we need much longer term data to look at the effects of vaping. Now, I am no doubt that if we look at longer term data, we will find...
When vaping first became a thing, when it first came onto the scene a few years ago, we were told that vaping was the safe alternative to smoking. And the question now, though, is were we wrong? Is vaping dangerous? Indeed, is vaping worse than smoking?
Short answer is, if you refer to smoking as, by which you mean tobacco smoking, then I think we are still correct in the sense that vaping is far safer than tobacco cigarette smoking. There's no doubt about it. I think everywhere you look in terms of the comparative data, vaping is less harmful. I hesitate to use the word safer because safe, I think, is a wrong way of looking at it. We're talking about arms reduction here. It's all comparative arms. Vaping is not safe. There's nothing better than fresh air to put into your lungs. So anything that you put into your lungs, by natural conclusion, you'd come to, you'd understand that it is not going to be safe. So vaping is not safe, should never be seen as a safe practice. However, if you're talking about something that's less harmful than tobacco smoking, so for people who smoke tobacco cigarettes, what is the best thing they can do? The best thing they can do for their health is to come off the tobacco cigarettes. Remember, in every single cigarette that someone smokes, tobacco cigarette, there are 8,000 different distinct chemicals. 8,000 different distinct chemicals that go into your lung with every single cigarette that someone smokes. So you're talking about 20, 30 cigarettes a day. You're getting incredible amounts of harmful stuff deposited in your lungs, that the lung, as efficient an organ as it is, there's no way it can clear these toxins, these toxicants as we call them. So if you're talking about vaping, once again, in terms of relative comparison, it may contain, depends who you believe, anything between 6 and 20 different chemicals for the vast majority of vapes. And some of the more tightly regulated vapes contain towards a closer lower end. And the ones that we are exposed to in the UK market should sit between 6 and 10, 6 and 12 different chemicals. So in terms of comparative risk, and that's where we should be talking about vaping and its role, then it is less harmful than cigarettes. But of course, there are these other huge issues around vaping that people are getting more and more concerned, people like myself as well. One is the uptake of vaping in young people and people who have never smoked before, thinking that it's a cool thing to do or it's a harmless thing to do. So that's one big area. The other big area is the area in which the industry are putting loads of flavors out. And flavoring is a problem. Now, those of us who don't vape, we don't appreciate the attractiveness of flavoring. So at one stage in my research, I've been doing this for 12 years now. But at one stage, I used to think you should just only have nicotine flavors, nothing else. And vaping should just be nicotine flavors, full stop. But the more I speak to people who vape, who are ex-smokers, there is an attraction for having some alternatives to just the nicotine flavors. So I've moved from a very strict position of saying you should only have nicotine flavors and nothing else in vape to saying you should have very tightly regulated small numbers of flavoring that can be analyzed, controlled, regulated by the regulatory authorities so that we know precisely what's going into it and whether or not there's a degree of harm. The problem now is that there are about 40,000 different flavors of vapes around the world. Any chemist sitting in the back street of Shanghai can come up with a chemical that smells nice and start selling it with no evidence of safety whatsoever. And it just overwhelms every single regulatory authority around the world. So there's no way with 40,000 plus chemicals that you can make any sense of how safe any of those flavors are. Whereas if there are 5 or 6, you could potentially go and do some detailed in-depth analysis and follow up long-term. Right now, as a researcher, there's no way I can look at flavorings and make any sense of it because there's so many, and the options out there are just crazy. So, and of course, there's an additional issue when you talk about young people of flavorings, attracting young people with things like bubblegum flavor, unicorn flavor. There's only one group that you're looking to attract with that sort of marketing strategy. So I think they're positives, and we must be very, very careful. And this is what I've been saying for years, that we must be nuanced in the way in which we as society look at vaping. We cannot see it as black and white. It's not bad or good. It has a role, particularly for tobacco smokers to come off smoking tobacco, but it should be a limited role. So it should be something that you do to try and get off tobacco cigarettes, but in a way that is controlled, that you can eventually come off vaping as well. And that's the other good thing about vaping, because you have various styles of vapes. So you could literally, if you're truly in a program that gives you the understanding and knowledge, or if you're adequately incentivized or driven, you could naturally reduce the strength of the nicotine, because after all, we all know it's the nicotine that hooks the person into it. So you could start from a 20 milligram, 16, 12, 4, and then come off completely. And then eventually the craving is gone and you don't even need the vape. So it has a role to play, but we've got to be very nuanced in it. The problem with governments right now is there's a lot of stupidity out there in legislation, and people are just throwing the baby out with the bathwater, unfortunately. And so vapes are looked on as one group, say it's the next best thing to sliced bread, and the pro-vape industry and all those people, ex-smokers who feel so much better on vaping. And the other group think it's the product of the devil. And there's no in-between understanding that there is the nuance to this whole debate. And there's a lot of heat, not enough light.
I want to come back to a couple of the points that you made there, because you made some great points about selected cohorts like young people who are being attracted to this whole phenomenon of vaping, and again to government policies which, as you say, are failing all across the world. If we can come back to just to the basics, though, as far as the physiological implications of vaping are concerned, how does vaping affect our heart and our lungs compared with something like smoking?
That is a good question. So in the observational study, so I'll talk to you about our research. We did a study called Vesuvius. I think to date it was published in 2019, but to date it still remains the largest in-depth clinical trial looking at vascular effects of vaping, cardiovascular effects of vaping to date. And what we did basically is we looked at people who chronically smoke tobacco cigarettes, at least 20 a day, and switched them to either vaping with e-cigarettes with nicotine, e-cigarettes without nicotine, or an arm that didn't want to stop, they continued smoking. And we looked at their blood vessel function before and after we did that switch. We were particularly interested in the 1 month acute effects, the quick effects. See, you benefit really quickly from switching in the acute effects of switching to e-cigarettes from tobacco cigarettes. In a month, in these chronic smokers, there was about a 1.5% improvement in their vascular function, their blood vessel function. When they switched from tobacco cigarettes to e-cigarettes without nicotine, there's a 1.4% improvement if they went from tobacco cigarettes to e-cigarettes with nicotine. And if you combine both the e-cigarette arms together and compare them with the tobacco arm, that's about a 1.5% improvement. And that's just in a month. So if I can just contextualize that for you, a 1% improvement in your vascular function, if sustained over the long term, will reduce your risk of cardiovascular death by 13%. a 1% improvement. In a month, in just 1 month, chronic tobacco cigarette smokers were improving their blood vessel function by 1.5% by switching to e-cigarettes. And if you compare what smokers versus never smokers were like, these guys were going from being vascular endothelial function from being poor to somewhere midway between someone who smokes heavily and someone who's never smoked. And that was just in 1 month of coming off tobacco cigarettes. So when we talk about the benefits or the effects of e-cigarette, the large benefits or effects of e-cigarettes are because of the tobacco avoidance. It's basically coming off the tobacco is the big thing, irrespective of how you do it. But e-cigarettes don't seem to have that much of a long-term detrimental effect when we look at certain markers, but perhaps there might be others that we need longer time to follow up on. So for example, as you started off saying, vaping is relatively new. It's in the last 15, 20 years that it's taken off in a big way. So we need much longer term data to look at the effects of vaping. Now, I have no doubt that if we look at longer term data, we will find that there's an attendant risk to vaping. Whether or not there is a degree of vascular function detriment, maybe not as bad as tobacco cigarettes, but certainly some level of detriment to blood vessel function. In the long term, it remains to be seen. But I have no doubt if we follow these people up, vapers, young people who started vaping today, if we follow them up for 20 years, we'll find that they have a higher risk in terms of vascular dysfunction to people who have never vaped. Because I go back to my initial point, which is there's putting something artificially with chemicals into your bloodstream is never going to be without effect. There's a cause and effect for everything. And the question is, if you consistently do it at the level, there's possibly some attendant risk in the long term. We haven't been able to quantify it just because we haven't had enough time to follow. And the big problem of observational studies, which the moment I get all these media requests to comment on these studies that come out, these observational studies on vaping causing increased harm, heart attacks risk. It's a complete and utter nonsense because 90% of vapers are people who smoked before. And to disentangle the previous exposure of tobacco cigarettes from vaping is impossible to do. We wanted to do a long-term follow-up study, a detailed coronary scanning of the heart of vapers versus smokers to follow them up over a long period of time. But the British Heart Foundation thought it wasn't important enough. They didn't support our research grant, unfortunately. So we've got to look elsewhere. But we wanted to do detailed, in-depth coronary artery scanning of these vapers versus smokers over a long period of time and follow them up. We have the expertise, we have the knowledge, the technical ability to do that. And we think it's an important enough subject to do. But unfortunately, as yet, we've not been successful with the BHF in getting them to see that this is a necessary trial to do. It's never going to be a clean trial because it's a pragmatic trial. We live in the real world where people who vape will take the occasional cigarette in the weekend with their friends, etc. But we can correct for all of those things statistically and with measuring their exposure to tobacco cigarettes in their urine, etc., etc. So we can do all of those things. And I think it's needing to be done, a study like that.
These vaping devices are similar to cigarettes in that they are nicotine delivery devices. How is the method of delivery different, or indeed, is there any difference in the delivery of nicotine when you compare these vapes with cigarettes or to traditional tobacco products?
So that is an excellent question because I think that goes right to the heart of the difference between these two products. The tobacco cigarettes deliver nicotine via combustion. Okay, so you burn the nicotine and you inhale the smoke that comes off from it. Okay, combustion is a very poor way of delivering nicotine to your system. So in a cigarette, for example, you'll get about 10% of the total nicotine content of that cigarette into the system through a traditional tobacco cigarette. The e-cigarettes are far more efficient in delivering this because it basically heats up a liquid that contains nicotine and you're inhaling the vapor. So yeah, in terms of a delivery device, an e-cigarette is far more efficient than a tobacco cigarette in terms of delivering the stuff. Combustion is a terrible way of delivering stuff to the body. And of course, the other problem, as I said, when you're burning the nicotine in the tobacco cigarette, you're burning the 7,999 other chemicals. And so you're in that smoke that is contained within tobacco cigarette. You're inhaling not just the nicotine, but you're also inhaling a whole host of other things in smoke. So it's not vapor that contains nicotine, that is nicotine rich, that is delivered via an e-cigarette. So the difference is stark. Tobacco cigarettes are very poor delivery method. Combustion is a very poor delivery method. Heat not burn, which is what now most vapes are now, basically heat up the nicotine liquid, nicotine containing liquid, I should say, and the vapor then you inhale. So you may have heard of companies in the States, for example, that have got very, very high levels of nicotine in their Juul is one good example of where you have very thick concentrations, strong concentrations of nicotine in their liquid pods, which we don't have here in the UK, or we should not have really legally. There's sort of 40 milligrams, etc. That gives you a huge nicotine hit. And nicotine, to some extent, I'm not being flippant about this, but nicotine has the similar sort of effect to a very, very strong cup of coffee. It's a very short-acting, acute effect. There has not been any study that has demonstrated long-term nicotine exposure causing significant effects. So, for example, John Britton and colleagues in Nottingham did a very large observational study of people on nicotine patches. So they're exposed to nicotine as well. And so if nicotine was significantly harmful, if you follow these people, they're also going to get more heart attacks and strokes than people who weren't on nicotine patches. But there was no difference in incidence of cardiovascular events in people who are exposed to nicotine patches, nicotine gums, etc. So I think the long-term harm of nicotine is less than some people would like to think. A lot of the harm of nicotine is that acute effect. You get the heart rate change, the blood pressure change, all those acute effects. And those can be important on their own right. Because, of course, for somebody with very high blood pressure and you get a huge nicotine hit and your heart rate goes up, your blood pressure goes up, that acute effect can be significant too. So I'm not downplaying the acute effect, but largely the effects of nicotine are acute rather than chronic.
Very interesting. So the downside then, one of the biggest downsides of vaping is the fact that it's just so efficient at delivering nicotine to the system because it comes via vapor. The other thing I wanted to ask you just on this, as far as people's use of vapes are concerned, and I've noticed this, is that they actually use vapes differently from cigarettes in that they tend to inhale more frequently per minute, and they tend to inhale deeper than they would when they were taking a drag on a cigarette. Could you talk to me about the implications of this?
So it's in the mechanics. I think an engineer will explain this far better than me, but I work with some flow dynamics people and physics in University of St. Andrews. And they tell me the resistance when you pull in with a typical tobacco cigarette is far greater than with an e-cigarette. So there's much less resistance when you inhale in with an e-cigarette. So you're therefore able to inhale in larger volumes than you would with a cigarette because cigarettes go through filters. And therefore there's resistance in terms of your inhalation, okay? The other thing to say is that because e-cigarettes are so efficient, you have these issues like the EVALIs, the lung problems that came with vapes a few years ago. People are dying in hospitals around both sides of the pond. You remember a lot of heat about and they were called e-cigarettes, e-cigarette vaping associated lung injury. But actually, if you look at it, what these people were using, they were using cannabis. They were using vitamin E acetate as a cutting agent in cannabis oil. And these are not vapes. These are called dab pens. If you speak to the punters out on the street, they know more than me and you put together. They call these things dab pens. They are very different from vapes, e-cigarettes. And the dab pens are even more effective because they have higher heat. And they heat up cannabis oil and they inhale it. And it's the cutting agent in cannabis oil, vitamin E acetate, which basically caused all these lung issues, these EVALI issues a few years ago. But that got conflated with e-cigarettes. And so a lot of people then went, oh, well, e-cigarettes are killing people, etc., etc. If they were killing people, the number of people who are smoking e-cigarettes today, hospitals would be overwhelmed with lung issues with e-cigarettes. So they're not the dab pens with the vitamin E acetate. But if you're talking about efficiency of devices, they are grades of efficiency. So least efficient is combustion. You've got e-cigarettes, you've got these dab pens, high heat devices as well.
Let's revisit the subject of young people getting into vaping, and these are young people who might not have even smoked before. I know certainly in this country and in some other countries there have been moves to ban the sale of these vapes to people under the age of 16, and hopefully that will spread around the world sooner rather than later. Could you talk to me about the implications physiologically on the heart, on the cardiovascular system and on the lungs of somebody who vapes who isn't fully developed yet, somebody who is 14, 15, 16 years of age? What are the implications in the short term and longer term for them as far as you would predict?
That's a good question. The short answer, if I'm being completely honest, is we don't know. But if you look at the theory behind how chemical exposure to vascular endothelial cells are the cells that line the blood vessels. They're like the carpet on a floor, essentially. And you require these endothelial cells to be reactive when they constrict or dilate to allow blood to flow, etc., etc. The theory, and perhaps there's some emerging evidence that particularly in young people whose vascular endothelial cells are developing, so they're not mature, they're not producing all the full complement of the molecules, the chemicals that we would expect in an adult blood vessel to be able to dilate and to constrict when necessary according to demands of the heart and the organs. That level of chemical production, something called nitric oxide, which is basically a vasodilatory chemical that the blood vessels produce to open up the blood vessels. And that chemical, perhaps that nitric oxide levels fall in young people who are exposed to vaping. So there is some signal that in a developing blood vessel that you might be causing some level of harm, but we have no good firm evidence to say this one way or the other because we just have not been able to do enough clinical trials on these people. Young people don't want to engage in these trials because they don't want to be told that what they're doing is harmful. So recruiting for these trials are difficult. But there is some signal that certainly your nitric oxide production from your blood vessel is attenuated, is less mature, less developed in people who vape when they are young. So I think I share the concerns. I've been calling for this for a long time. I think young people need to have better education in terms of the choices that they're making. They need to be aware of the implications, the longer-term implications. But unless we do more research in these areas and we do more follow-up long-term studies, and unless funders start appreciating that this is really an important societal issue that could impact everyone in 40, 50 years' time, we're not going to get anywhere at the moment. So we are running another trial at the moment looking at passive exposure of vaping. So that's another interesting area for me, because you would never stand next to somebody who's smoking tobacco cigarettes and happily breathe in all the smoke that comes out from a tobacco cigarette. But a lot of people don't mind standing next to someone who vapes because there's a little bit of a sweet smell. It's a vapor that dissipates into the air quite quickly. It's not that offensive to people. So you see a lot of vapors standing around people and they happily chat, but we have no idea whether or not those vapors and the vapes, the particulate matter that comes out of vapes are harming people. So parents who vape in cars with children in them, parents who vape at homes where children sit, we are particularly interested in young children and women to see what's happening. So we're running a study in conjunction with some food chemists and some chemists in St. Andrews University across the water and Abertay University here in Dundee, looking at the impacts of passive exposure, particularly to women and children. And it's an area that fascinates me. I'm really keen to know whether we should be more stringent in terms of how we ban vaping. Because, of course, you'll see that some places say they allow vaping outdoors, but not smoking. Some places don't allow it. And it's all confused everywhere because there's not enough good quality information out there.
I'd be really interested to find out the results of that particular study. What kind of timeline would you be talking about as to the results?
So we're just halfway through the recruitment at the moment. So I think perhaps by summer next year, we should have a closer idea as to what the results are looking like.
We've spoken already about these vapes being very efficient nicotine delivery devices. How does that interplay then with people's ability then to use these devices as a smoking cessation tool? How efficient are they at helping people stop smoking?
So a group, Peter Hayek's group down in London did this study a few years ago, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, where they basically looked at different smoking cessation methods. So they compared vapes versus nicotine patches versus nicotine gums, and found that if you on the arm of the vape, in the vaping arm, you're far more likely to stay off tobacco cigarettes at 12 months, at 18 months. You're far more likely to not be smoking cigarettes ad hoc than if you were on the nicotine gum and the nicotine patch arm. So it's clearly a very effective way in which people get their cravings out of the system, because that is the main thing when you're trying to get off tobacco cigarettes. It's a craving. Apart from the fact that you have something in your hand to hold when you have a cup of coffee with a cigarette, the other thing that misses is that nicotine craving. And if you can deal with that craving, I think a lot of the battle is won. And because it's such an efficient way of delivering nicotine into the system, it is certainly, from Peter's work, the more efficient way of stopping tobacco cigarette smokers from continuing to be exposed to tobacco smoke. And if you ask me, that's where vaping's role should really lie. It should be in that very confined space of trying to get people off tobacco smoke, because we must see the bigger picture. Tobacco cigarettes are still killing more people than anything else worldwide. So we need to get people off tobacco cigarettes. And vaping has a very defined role for me in that space. But of course, the other question really is, in people who vape, if they are supported within a structured program. So in other words, if they're given the information, say, you're going to try and stop smoking. Here is a 16 milligram cartridge of vape. In 4 weeks' time, when you come back to us, what we're going to try and do is reduce that to 12, and then to 8, and then to 4, and then just nicotine flavor alone. And if you're just on nicotine flavor alone, then there's nothing to stop your cravings. There's no nicotine in the system, so you really could do without the vaping. And in that sort of a step-down approach, in a program structured step-down approach, you could potentially use vapes to get people off tobacco smoking.
Do you believe that vapes should only be available via prescription through a medical professional instead of being available over the counter?
No, I don't think that is necessary, because because medics everywhere are overworked, and I don't think the last thing my GP colleagues would want is for me to say, well, get all the vapors in there and run a structured vaping program. I think we must trust people. That the problem is we need to give, as researchers, it's our responsibility to provide good quality evidence and data, and trust people to make good decisions when they have good data to make decisions on. You cannot legislate for everything to the nth degree. And I think we need to give some level of trust to the public out there. But the onus is on us to provide that good quality information of the consequence of vaping, how you come off cigarette smoking, the role that vaping should play, all those things. Health professionals and researchers, the onus is on us to do that.
You mentioned legislation there. Can we talk about the role that governments can take in this and legislators around the world?
Yeah. So I think for starters, the easy win for me would be to severely restrict flavorings in vapes. I genuinely cannot understand why there is lethargy around this. People should be desperate to do this. Government should be desperate to just completely restrict the flavoring in vapes down to 4 or 5 flavors or whatever, and enable that to be a manageable level. I'm just picking 4 on the number. It could be any manageable number, not 40,000 essentially. It's nuts. It's completely crazy at the way we're going at the moment. So I think that's an easy win. That would be my key thing. Second thing is really to make sure that people understand the role of vaping, and young people understand that there is possibly consequence, although we're not entirely sure there's likely consequence of taking up vaping when you've never smoked before. And we need people who are in positions of influence to not be, vaping out there. Young people are very influenced by pop stars or whatever other people, and there's a lot of that going on too. My main low hanging fruit in terms of legislation would be the making it less attractive, because at the moment it seems as cool, it's attractive. Both those things need to be that we need to debunk those things. So vapes should be like cigarettes, in the most bland packaging, locked up at the back, not with 100,000 colors in a display cabinet in front for people to pick on. And we should be restricting flavors. We should be telling people when they buy vapes, pointing them to good quality websites where you could talk about sort of coming off or sort of reducing your strengths, weaning off smoking cessation type stuff. And the problem is, I don't know about Ireland, but in the UK, a lot of smoking cessation services have had their fundings removed. And so we used to have a very, very good smoking cessation service here, and a lot of that has gone now. And it's been kind of left to GPs and community practitioners to do. And that's not helpful in a situation like this.
Ultimately, I think the main takeaway here is that if you are going to resort to vaping as a substitute for your smoking habit, you should do so in a structured way and only for a short period of time.
Yes, have a plan as to what you'd like to do and when you'd like to get off nicotine altogether. Because if you've made the decision to come off tobacco smoking, then you clearly understand the risks of what's happening to your health. And you have already bought into some level of health improvement. So why not go the full way and say, well, I'm going to stop smoking. I'm going to start vaping at this concentration of nicotine, but I'm going to make an effort every so often to wean myself down the nicotine concentration until I get to zero. And then I'll ask myself, do I really need to spend money on vapes? I can possibly come off it altogether and try and come off the vapes altogether. It would be great if we had the resource of sufficient medical professional support in all of this to do. We are where we are worldwide in terms of a resource, but there are things that people can do, and there's enough information, I think, for them to do, as I've just mentioned.
Earlier on, you mentioned your study, Vesuvius, which is probably the most comprehensive study today. Where can people find out more about that particular research study?
So it's published in the Journal of American College of Cardiology, JACC. So if you Google Vesuvius George e-cigarette, I'm sure that paper will come up. And it was we had over 200 media outlets carrying the story when it came out in 2019. I think the only continent that didn't carry the story is Antarctica. We had every other continent carried that story, and it continues to generate huge amounts of interest. Even now, I just got an email just last week saying that there are 5 new Wikipedia pages that have referenced Vesuvius. So it just continues to generate because people are desperate for good quality data out there. And we need more of it, I think.
Well, courtesy of people like yourself, hopefully that data will come thick and fast in the coming months and years. I will pop a link to that research study in the show notes for this episode. But thank you so much for your time today, Professor Jacob George.
Yeah, more than welcome, and nice speaking to you. Take care now.
Hey, if you enjoyed that video, check out this video here, which tells you how to get rid of that stubborn belly fat.